Hello everyone and welcome back to the office. I apologize for the overexposure today. I've got my window open and it's extremely bright outside and it seems to be shining right on my face, so I do apologize. In addition, I'm going to apologize for one other thing, which is that your grades for your exam took so long to reset themselves. Now, I feel good about the fact that I'm still within my 2-week period of getting it back to you, but what I don't feel great about is that you got the first half of your grades and then not the second half. And you might be wondering, what the heck kind of incompetence is that? Well, the answer is simple. Brightspace has an extra button that we have to push, and it's not intuitive. It doesn't pop up for us. It's something that we have to go in and actually push to publish your grades. And I clearly haven't gotten the hang of that yet. So as we work with Brightspace, I think maybe all of your professors are still learning it a little bit, but as we've switched over, we will learn these little quirks. So by the time you see this, you'll have your grade, the corrected grade. So thank you to those few of you who did in fact email me and ask sort of what the heck's going on, because that clearly didn't happen on Tuesday. The other thing that didn't happen on Tuesday was me giving you a lecture for this week. I'm not sure how much you mind that, but the reason was because I was stuck at the office, and I told you I normally do your lectures on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I don't know how to word this so it doesn't sound bad, but I have a class at 12:30 and then I have office hours from 2 to 4, and that's usually when I work and record your videos. And unfortunately, this time around, I just had like 3 students who decided that it was a really good idea to stick around and talk to me for a really long time. And that's okay. But I had somewhere I had to be at 5, so I didn't get a chance to post your video. So here we are today with this video. What are we doing? We are moving from the sort of Enlightenment period into the modern. And I really think these two theorists that we're talking about today are a good transition for us. Why? Well, as I told you, during the medieval period, there was this sort of triangle of debate between what was reason, what was aesthetic, and where rhetoric fits with that. We know that Peter Ramus started off this discussion by saying you divide the canons into style and delivery versus invention, arrangement, and memory, right? And the sort of invention, arrangement, and memory are the content, if you will, and style and delivery is obviously the style or form of the actual speech itself, or your nonverbals as well. So that's sort of where that division began. I think I told you that. And then we talked about Bacon and Vico and others who were talking specifically about science, or even more accurately, they call it reason. And that makes sense. One of the things that I want you to remember as we go through this are the faculties, because they're about to come up in our first author today, which is George Campbell. George Campbell was Scottish, and he was some part of a liturgy, some part of the clergy, I believe. But most of them were coming out of the medieval period, we know that, and he was really interested in courtroom rhetoric and how sort of things lived in the courtroom rhetoric rather than anything else. He separates these out sort of the way that St. Augustine did, right? He's got the preaching, which is different from teaching, which is different from arguing in court. He spends a lot of time on that last one. He relates each of certain faculties with a certain style of delivery that you need to use in order to be successful and persuasive. So I'll let you read that, because in the introduction to George Campbell, the book does a really good job of giving you sort of like what faculties go with what style and for what purpose. I'll let you read that because that's a little bit boring for me. Just know that his work on style and those faculties are very, very important. So know those. What I want to focus on, however, is what he says should happen in a courtroom. And specifically, he talks about kinds of evidence that we can use to be persuasive in order to make good arguments. Now, as we move into the modern, we're going to be talking a lot more about the construction of arguments in their role in persuasion. And that means that there's going to be some focus on evidence. Now, we know that Aristotle divided up different kinds of reasoning and different types of evidence. George Campbell sort of does the same thing. However, he uses slightly different words. So the good news is that on your previous exam was inductive and deductive reasoning, that sort of Neo-Aristotelian stuff that we really needed to study. For this next test, we're going to talk about two other ways to reason that come from George Campbell. And they have similar names to what Aristotle said, but they are not defined exactly the same way. So the good news is I'm not going to, make you know the differences or keep that in mind when you're taking an exam. This will definitely be on the second exam, and I won't be hearkening back to confuse you with Aristotle. What are those things that he talks about? In terms of argument, he's talking about specifically in the courtroom, two types of evidence, intuitive and deductive. Now, I don't want you to get confused. That's not inductive and deductive, and it's certainly still not deductive in the way that Aristotle explains it. So let's go through that. Intuitive sort of means scientific, sort of means what we experience, right? So remember when we talked about using the five senses particularly? Well, this is using your five senses or more to be able to make claims based off of evidence, things that we see, hear, smell, taste, etc. Okay? And so intuitive does not necessarily just mean like some sort of magical intuition or intuition in the way that we might talk about it today. Intuitive actually means that based on your experiences, you're able to draw conclusions because those experiences are evidence, okay? And there was a time when this type of argument and evidence was really, really popular, and I wish we could get back to it. But for now, we're sort of trapped in a different reality than that intuitive nature supposedly indicates that we are. Which leads us to the second type of evidence that George Campbell talks about, and that is specifically the deductive. And it does not mean deductive reasoning in the traditional way of, starting with a general principle and applying it to each individual circumstance or situation. Rather, deduction is broken up further into two types of deductive evidence. And the first one we're less concerned with. That, he says, is for science and math, and is not necessarily when we're debating, right? It's not for debate. It's there or it's not there. And it's been tested in some scientific way, perhaps at the time using the Baconian method, right? That there is evidence that we draw from study specifically. Not just our experiences like intuitive, but from study. This other thing that he calls the second type of deductive argument is when it's where rhetoric lives. It is when we talk about morals and values, and essentially I think what he's trying to get at here is what we might talk about discussing in sort of the public discourse. What are the social issues, the moral issues, the values that we all have that we want to base our arguments off of? A lot of times people are like, what do you mean by that? Okay, so let me give you this example, and hopefully this works. Whenever Congress people are debating a bill in Congress, for example, they will look at very specific policy parts, right? They look for a justification, whether or not this is needed. They look for any changes to previous law or if it's creating new law. They look at how we're going to fund the policy or enforce the policy. So you have to be pretty careful in the way that you examine policy. That's sort of a hard material thing that we can see on the page, right? We have a piece of paper or whatever we have, an email in this case, or whatnot, and it tells us the material things that we need to think about in terms of policy. That would be sort of, you know, where that lives. It doesn't live in the moral and value. It lives elsewhere. And therefore, it's not necessarily the purview of rhetoric. And if you think about this for a moment, science, when you go out and you do science, when you research something and you're doing it empirically, you're only reporting results, right? And you might draw some conclusions about how it fits into the greater sphere of that study, but that's it. You don't draw any moral reasoning from that. As opposed to, let's take that same congressional bill that we're talking about, the imaginary one, and what happens when we discuss it in the public sphere? What starts to happen is we start to say, well, this policy does not fit into our value of freedom, or it doesn't actually do what it says it's going to do. In some way, we qualify it. And that's what that is about, okay? So the public sphere, we have moral, social issues to discuss, and they are separate from policy and material issues. And those are the two types of evidence that he's talking about there. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully those, between his explanation and my examples, hopefully that helps a little bit. Okay, everybody, I am going to leave for just a moment, and when I come back for your second video, I will talk about Hugh Blair.